Levy Rosman, also known as Gothamchess, is known for having the largest chess channel on YouTube. But did you know he's also played some great over-the-board chess too? This was played at the peak of Levy's powers back in 2018, just before he achieved his first international master norm. Here we see we'll be looking at the game from Levy's perspective with the black pieces, as opponent opens with the move knight to f3. We see in Levy's notes, he says that he'd actually played this opponent before a year prior. He said revenge is always nice. He'd been preparing quite well for this game, obviously knew what his opponent would be opening the game with. D5, C4, the Reti Gambit, D4 by Levy, the advanced variation, and then B4 played by his opponent Cordova, just grabbing a bit of space on the queen side. And here I actually have Levy's notes himself in the analysis, and you can see that in this position, Levy said, it's quite rare you can comment on a game by move 3. This position is already quite unique. White disregards black's central pose and instead chooses to gain queenside space. There are many theoretical moves here, but he chose the one he thought would be a big surprise. He goes with G5. Of course, given the dubious thing by Levy himself, and he calls this a Navarra Gambit, basically seeking to have white off balance and cautious early on. Maybe trying to get his opponent into a bit of time trouble, which we will see later. So if White decides to capture the pawn with the knight, Levy's written here, it leads to chaos after E5, of course, hitting the knight. The knight will go back to E4, and F5, attacking the knight again. Knight moves to C5, A5, breaking up that queen side, and E3, just defend the center, sort of break it up in the Alekhine sort of style with this attacking the center from close to home. So the game continued with queen to B3. Levy, we see Levy just gets bishop in the game. The knight captures the pawn finally, and E5. We see the idea of the gambit to sacrifice that flank pawn and gain the central space. Another interesting thing about sacrificing the G pawn is now this file could be used for the rook in the future, but we're just going to see what happens. So queen G3. We see Levy decides to get his queen into the game. The knight finally shuffles back after being attacked. And then king to f8. Of course, Levy making intentions very clear from early on. He's not going to be castling. He's going to try and use his rooks to be very aggressive and try and rely on the pieces try and rely on the fact his pieces are very dynamic, try and get counterplay and attack that white king. His opponent decides to break up that queen side. Levy's having none of it. He wants to get his pieces into the game, increase his development, of course, playing a bit like that gambit style. So he gets a knight in the game. After he captures his opponent's left with a decision. He's got a lot of things to do here. He can maybe play a more passive move, like D3, trying to open up the bishop and we get the knight to that square, or he can try and address this light squared bishop. So he decides to do bishop to A3, doing any of those things, trying to pin the queen. Of course, is not a pain. He can just move the pawn, C5, and that pawn is defended twice for both sides. So of course, white cannot capture. We see queen slides over, and here Levy has a bit of a think. He's going to be very accurate here. He sacrificed material. He's down a pawn. He has to find the most accurate way to continue, and he plays a very nice looking move, bishop to B7. The idea, of course, pinning the knight to the queen and sort of stifling White's counterplay against his king, because of course his position is a bit airy. You know, those pieces are open, everything's sort of flying around, and you've got to be careful here. Levy himself even writes this is the critical moment of the game. Tension is peaking, and despite black seemingly covering everything, a nasty tactic lurks. But his opponent misses it and inside plays E3. Instead, he should have played knight takes C5, and all the tactics basically to White being 2 pawns up, but a little bit passive. As you can see in the line, Levy himself has provided knight takes C5, bishop recaptures after the queen takes. He has queen takes B7, and of course the rook is hanging, got to move that. Rook D8, and then queen has to slide back to B2. 2 pawns up, because of course wins the pawn here, and he has the pawn sacrifice earlier, with E2, E4 ideas, and maybe trying to trade queens and win that endgame. Of course, the opponent misses it, playing E3 instead. We see knight to F6, bishop to D3, and then Levy decides to bring his rook into the game. His opponent then decides to castle, which Levy here writes, on this move, he plays one of his favorite moves ever. In very Levy style, obviously dynamic attacking play, he decides to play H5. Of course, if in doubt, push a flank pawn is something he usually says. But here, it's not just a nothing move. We can see immediately his attentions are peaking. He's trying to get after that white king and create complications for that white position. Because of course, he is a pawn up. If you just sit around, you might lose the endgame. And maybe you can like hustle yourself a little draw, but it's going to be tough. You're going to be defending for a long time. It's not going to be pleasant. So of course, you've got to generate that counterplay quick. See queen to F5, and Levy just goes rook to H6, bringing that rook into the game through a rather unorthodox way. Because of course, he can't move that bishop anywhere useful, really. I mean, he goes H6, but it's much quicker to bring the rook into the game through the H file, which you conveniently opened up and moving that pawn. His opponent decides to go F3. It's sort of an idea you might play against a King's Indian, trying to slow down that F pawn advance, but I mean, Freddy the F pawn isn't going to be moving very much very quickly, so it's interesting why his opponent played this move. It's also trying to really secure that knight in the center, of course, only defended by a piece. Overprotection allows the piece to move a bit more freely. See rook to C6. His opponent decides to move the queen back because, of course, the queen was attacked. We see H4. The opponent captures. Levy captures back. And now we see that White's position is starting to become a bit more dire. See, all these pieces can be barreling towards the king side. Levy's got a lot of open attacking lines, so we try and swing that rook over there. And this white king is starting to feel a little bit more unsafe. His opponent decides to bring the bishop to a more active square, and here Levy goes king g8, which he himself has marked as a bit of a mistake. You think, well, why is that the case? He thinks this move is unnecessary and too slow. The king is fine on f8. His opponent was low on time, and he wanted to make a simple improving move and see if he would self-destruct, but of course you can't do that. If the opponent kept playing well, there's no way to give him the advantage like this, because you might obviously lose the game, or even sacrifice the draw, when of course you could have winning chances. We see his opponent captures, Levy captures back with the e-pawn, of course, opening up that queen, and then king f2 by his opponent, just trying to run through the hills to get that king out of the king side, because the king side is where it's all going to start kicking off. So Levy mentioned here he's going for rook e1, but black's initiative is just way too strong. But both of them overlooked a strong defensive resource here. In fact, here white can go bishop to c1 with ideas of playing d3 and completely locking down the position and slowly developing that queen side to make use of that extra pawn in a sort of endgame or a slow positional grinding position, which of course not what Levy is looking for here. Instead, in the game, obviously he moves the king, and Levy decides to go rook to h5, developing that rook and sort of putting a little bit of pressure on that bishop. The opponent brings the rook into the game, attacking the queen. The queen has to go somewhere, but again, it's not too clear where to move it. Levy decides to go queen to d6, keeping the queen on his important diagonal, eyeing that h2 pawn, and also making sure the queen has a way into the attack in the future. See d3, just trying to solidify the center. And here Levy finds a nice move, bishop to h6, and that bishop just wasn't doing anything on d7, let's be honest. So it's a typical idea in these sort of positions, get that bishop to h6, get it fighting on this fairly long diagonal. And now he's also putting a bit of pressure on this king. Now he's exploiting this move, king to f2, which is of course what you should always try and do, exploit your opponent's mistakes. Now this king is looking a bit worried. I mean, where is it even really going to go? Because if you decide to step onto the d file, maybe the queens are going to come in, the rook's going to be attacking, and your king's going to be in the center, which is exactly where you don't want it to be when your opponent has a bit more development. Because of course this knight and this rook are not in the game, so we're going to have to see what happens. Opponent plays rook to e4, and Levy says this is desperation, and he has a nice finish. Of course, he decides to take the rook with a knight. After the pawn recaptures, he decides to swing the queen in, deploying it to this e5 square. Basically, the idea of this move is to play a move like rook to f4, sacrifice the rook back for the piece. Of course, if your opponent sacrifices, a good way to get the initiative back is to sack back for the piece and continue your attack. Because obviously his opponent tried to sort of defuse the position, but it's just not worked. So king to e2, trying to get that king out of there. Rook takes f5, and after the recapture, he doesn't trade queens. He simply grabs that pawn, queen tries to trade. It's a little bit of shuffling as he obviously avoids the queen trade. And again, he's trying to move the king, and here we see a nice move of Levy. Rook to b6, setting a sneaky little threat, of course, of taking that knight, and of course, if white decides to recapture, there'll be checkmate on this d2 square. So of course, the opponent does not allow that. He slides his king over to protect that knight, and also to avoid all these sort of checkmates. But the problem is, in the attempt to escape, he's walked into a mating net. Bishop to c6 simply ends the game. It is checkmate in 8. I think the best sequence for white. I'll just run through it quickly. So of course, king goes back. Of course, you can't just grab this rook, because again, this checkmate hangs. Of course, the king has to move up, can't take the rook, so the king goes to c2. You've got the queen back. Queen takes f7 check, just desperation, because mate is just coming with his really strong pieces. I think king h8 is a more clinical win, because you can decide to take this queen, then you step onto the f file. It's just tiny things to prolong the game a little bit more. This is sort of engine-y stuff. Of course, the opponent will resign in this position, and we see how Levy managed to get a brilliant win with the black pieces in his usual attacking, very aggressive style. Just love to see that from Levy. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.